this edition of the India Development Debate. I'm Supriya Shrinate and thank you very much for joining us back. This could be a setback for our already troubled economy. The present government may overshoot its fiscal deficit target for the year. In a super exclusive that ET Now brought to you earlier today, we learned that about 60,000 crore rupees shortfalls in direct tax revenues may push up the fiscal gap a lot higher than the revised 3.4%. Now, government sources tell us that advanced tax, TDS or salaried class may not grow over 17%, and 15,000 crore, remember, is the outgo of refunds. How does this shape the fiscal slippage? What does it mean for the economy? What will it mean in an election year? Another 30-35 days away for elections. Many questions, and we're going to get you some of those answers on the India Development Debate right here. But before I go any further, let me quickly take it across to my colleague Ruchi Bhatia, who brought that exclusive story to us to put it all in perspective. What is the story all about? Why could there be a breach of the Fisc? And where is the trouble as far as tax collections are concerned?
On February 1st, when Interim Finance Minister Piyush Goyal presented the interim budget, he said that the FY19 direct tax collection target will be revised upwards from 11.5 lakh crore rupees to 12 lakh crore rupees. And if you look at the current numbers, we are far behind in chasing the revenue. As on February 20th, tax collections are only at about 8 lakh crore rupees on the direct tax collection front, which means that we're far behind and the government needs to do much more in a bid to meet the target. But looks like this is going to be a tall order this time around, and India is all set to miss the FY19 revised direct tax collection target by at least 50 to 60,000 crore rupees. Now, why is that? We're given to understand that two key components that account for almost 80% of the tax collections, which is advanced tax and TDS, may not grow at more than 17%. In fact, to meet the target, these two heads, that is advanced tax and TDS, need to grow at a percentage of 40%, at a rate of 40% from now to March end, which of course is highly unlikely. On top of it, add to that the refunds that will go. We're given to understand that the government is estimating at least 15,000 crore worth of outgo in tax refunds before March end, which leaves us with big questions on the credibility of the budget numbers. 1 month back, we were told that the government will be meeting the fiscal deficit target of 3.4%, and the government will be meeting the direct tax collection target as well. And now we're given to understand that we are far behind in that. Was the government too optimistic when they gave out these numbers? What will this lead to? If you look at the GDP data for the third quarter, we got a reading of 6.6%, which was the lowest that we saw in many quarters. And will the advanced tax really be able to grow at that kind of a pace? Was the government, were the tax officials too optimistic when they gave out those numbers, and could this lead to harassment of the taxpayers? Those are, of course, pressing questions that we need answers to at this point of time. We're also understanding that the markets still seem to be unnerved. Given the fact that this is an election year, there is going to be a lot of expenditure. The government has already promised on various fronts that they will be providing relief to common man, to the agriculture community. Will this mean that the fiscal deficit may slip from a current level of 3.4% to 3.5%? That, of course, is the big risk. The government so far has been maintaining that they will stick to the fiscal deficit target. However, it seems that they will have to resort to creative fiscal management.
All right, let me take this discussion forward with a panel of experts who are joining us right here. And Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, joins us. Our consulting editor, Maithili Bhusnurmat, is here with us. Mr. N.R. Bhanumurthy, Professor of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, is here with us. And so is Mr. Sameer Narang, Chief Economist at the Bank of Baroda. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us. And Maithili, if I may start with you, just a month ago, Interim Finance Minister Piyush Goyal had revised the direct tax collections upwards from 11.5 lakh crore rupees to 12 lakh crore rupees. A month later, it looks like the tax department could be falling short of about 50,000 to 60,000 crore rupees in the final figures. The market obviously reacted extremely sharply to when we put out that news break. But somewhere, I mean, beyond numbers and beyond all of this, does it not hurt the credibility and the sanctity of data that's put out in budget numbers?
Well, yes, it certainly does, Supriya, but overestimation of revenues and underestimation of expenditure is a common trait of all governments. And frankly, budget estimates by now really do not carry very much credibility. Partly also because many governments, in fact, not just this government, past governments also have been taking a lot of expenditure off the budget. That means they go up below the belt, as it were, and completely below the line, and we don't get it reflected in the budget deficit at all. So this is what is done in order to keep the budget numbers, the fiscal deficit within the target. But in fact, the actual fiscal deficit will be much, much larger. So over a period of time, budget estimates have lost a great deal of credibility. But the fact is, when such things happen repeatedly, the picture becomes worse and worse. And that is what I think the government must try very hard not to do. But this, I think, is a very common trait, particularly when elections are looming. Governments always tend to overestimate their revenues, and expenditure always tends to shoot up, particularly because we'll see a large number of freebies, and that is equally true of the present government.
No doubt about that. But very quickly, if I may move forward, and Professor Bhanumurthy, if I may come to you. From somebody who tracks macro data, and policies are made on macro data, is this uncomfortable? Is this discomforting for you to see that numbers, we're not meeting targets, but the reality is that these were budget numbers. Is it uncomfortable for you to see the sanctity of data being breached time and again?
Yeah, I think the fiscal marksmanship seems to be taking a hit in the last couple of years, largely because of the kind of revision that we are seeing in the GDP numbers. So if you look at 16-17, 17-18 as well as for 18-19, the revisions in the GDP numbers are quite sharp. So if you want to understand the whole revenue projections, I think it is a function of GDP numbers. So when there is an errors in the GDP estimations, obviously your revenue forecasts also go wrong. So I think that is what is happening, and I was never surprised that for 2018-19 the fiscal deficits numbers will be very different from 3.3%. I have been telling for quite some time. And in any case, we are going to see the final number maybe in the month of June or July, I'm sure that you are going to see a very different number from 3.4%. But in any case, if you look at the current year, the shortfall, as you rightly pointed out, particularly on the tax side, is going to be very substantial, and again that is because of expected decline in the nominal GDP growth, which the government assumed at 11.7% in the beginning of the year, and the nominal GDP growth actually would be much lower than the 11.7%. So in that sense, I think you are going to see a reduction in the tax revenue collections. But I think somebody pointed out earlier, I think government generally overestimate revenues and underestimate expenditures. But in my view, if you look at, I think one needs to really see this recent CAG report very carefully, how the government in the past couple of years trying to push some of the expenditure below the budget documents. I think that is a much more concern for me. In any case, I think my concern is, if you look at my concern, I think it is more to do with revenue deficit target rather than the fiscal deficit target. I think that's a very serious issue.
Professor Bhanumurthy, I'll have to come in there, and my only request to all of you on this show is that just make your answers brief, because I have a lot of ground to cover and this is an important discussion to have. But good to have you back, Mr. Gopalan. And sir, advance tax and TDS contribute to 80% of the direct tax kitty. The growth in both is around 16%. Back of the envelope calculations say that tax collections have to grow by at least 40% from now to March to meet the targets. Is that even feasible, or have we completely lost the bus?
Okay, I mean, I would like to tell you that in the last quarter, the last advance tax paid in the March 15th, that carries a huge number. The percentage is a little huge, and therefore I feel that, I mean, these numbers of 15 or 16% which you are taking into account of the growth rate, it certainly go up to the extent that, I mean, it will certainly, I mean, go up. there is a TDS. This thing TDS will remain in the same way it has been behaving so far. But as far as the advance tax is concerned, that is going to be a plus as we go along, and that is going to contribute to increased revenue. But at the same time, one of your channel mentioned that there is going to be a shortfall of close to 50,000 crores. I don't think it is going to be to that extent. It's going to be around about 25,000 crores. But that will, if the expenditure is maintained at this level, fiscal deficit is likely to be 3.46, and if the shortfall is going to be 50,000 crores and expenditure maintained at the same level, it will be 3.59. But in any case, you know, government has a way of cutting down expenditures to match the fiscal deficit number of 3.4.
All right, I want to just, marry this with the macro data. And Samir Narang, if I may throw this to you, the third quarter reading of the GDP was at 6.6%. So obviously there is weakness and perhaps structured weakness in the economy right now. When you marry this data for the advance tax payments that need to come for that time and all of this, there seems to be more than just meets the eye. And the micro, which is really targeted tax collection versus GDP growth of Q3, which is at 6.6, seems to be creating more room for concern and fear, does it not?
Well, actually, I'm not that pessimistic on the entire data. So what has happened is that last quarter there was a sharp reduction in overall government spending in order to meet the Fisc, and at the same time there was a slowdown in agriculture production, which has driven the GDP growth or the GVA growth lower. But if you look at the fiscal numbers, what the government has done is that it has increased in the revised estimate versus the last year's budget estimate in FY19. They've increased the corporate tax collections by 50,000 crore, and that was done because as the data which the government had when going into the budget, the corporate tax collections were running far ahead of the budgetary estimate prepared in the last year on 1st of Feb. Now, I agree with Mr. Gopalan that there can be a little bit of slowdown in terms of, or it can be slightly lower than what the projection was done on 1st Feb, but it seems like this 50,000 crore number is far higher than the actual shortfall. The actual shortfall can be far lower than that. And if the trend in terms of overall direct and indirect tax collections and corporate tax collections is actually fairly robust up to the data available till December and now January. So I do not expect a very sharp reduction suddenly in this data. And to the extent the GDP data goes, there are certain indicators which are pointing towards, so it's a mixed bag actually. There are certain indicators which show that growth private consumption may hold up better next year because government is doing direct benefit transfers, and exports of services continue to be at a fairly robust pace compared to export of goods. So there are mixed, indicators within the GDP data as well.
I will go to Maithili
I
now.
think there is some bit of cyclical slowdown.
Okay,
yeah.
Mr. Narang. Okay, Mr. Narang, I'm sorry I'm cutting you short there. My only request to all of you is please make your answers brief. It will give me more time to address more questions. Maithili, the DA Secretary continues to say that the government will meet the fiscal deficit target of 3.4%. But where are the options? I mean, there is a shortfall in direct tax collection. GST revenues are still wobbly weak. We've not seen the kind of enforcement, perhaps due to elections, that one would have. The REC PFC deal has to be concluded in the next 3 weeks. Refunds of close to 15,000 crore rupees have still to be given. My question is that, do you fear, are you concerned that we will yet again see another government resort to creative fiscal management?
Well, yes, Supriya, creative fiscal management has always been par for the course. It's just the degree, how much of fudging is done. If the numbers lose credibility completely, then we'll find the rating agencies are not going to take anything that we say seriously. So some amount of fudging is perhaps, I wouldn't say acceptable, but it's becomes so routine that people don't raise eyebrows. But if the fiscal creativity becomes so much that the numbers lose all value, that would be a very dangerous game to play. Hopefully the government will not do that. But there's one thing that comes to a government's rescue, is that government's budgeting is done on the basis of cash, not on the basis of accrual. So it can always postpone its expenditure, and that would not be considered complete fudging. So that is what is undesirable. It would not be a very happy circumstance, but it's quite a possibility.
Okay, I seem to have lost Maithili's audio here, but let me just quickly go across to Mr. Gopalan. And sir, where does this take future fiscal deficit targets? I mean, every successive year, we have a shifting of the goalpost as far as the fiscal norms are concerned. The government says it's committed to it. Given an election year, many people are worried that we will perhaps see that widen even more. And you alluded to this previously. What is this due to future fiscal management and targeting?
Well, I think a fiscal deficit as we go along, if that fiscal deficit leads to more capital expenditure, I will be satisfied. But the fact is it is not. But more than fiscal deficit, Supriya, I am more interested in knowing government, the debt to GDP. That is more important for me, because that has a great effect on the outstanding loans, the interest rates that can happen on account of the on the G-Secs and those kind of issues, which can have an impact on the interest rate for the market. So I am more concerned about the debt, accumulated debt to GDP, and there I think that the numbers are not proving to be so good currently, but down the line, if government sticks to what it says, it is possible that it can behave. But remember, the debt to GDP also includes the states debt to GDP, and states debt are increasing. They are not in any case coming down. So that is an area where I will be more focused on rather than on the fiscal deficit numbers.
Okay, fair point indeed. Mr. Banamurthy, I'll come to you, and I think one of the things that some people are talking about is disinvestment targets, and I will come to tax and all of that in just a bit. But disinvestment targets, by a magic hand of the state, we will again meet that. We will perhaps super exceed it like we did last year with an ONGC, HPCL kind of a deal and REC, PFC kind of. But this is not genuine disinvestment. And as somebody who tracks macro data and who looks at policy formation happen on account of this, how worrying is that?
Yes, I think all indications suggest that the disinvestment targets for the current year, again we are going to slip on that. But to be fair to the government, I think the markets were also not really conducive for going ahead in terms of the disinvestment program. So in that sense, it will have huge implications on the macro in overall fiscal deficit. But at the same time, I think my own concern is very limited on the disinvestment side, but more on how, as Maithili pointed out, how credible are these fiscal deficit numbers. So I think that is my more worry than the disinvestment targets.
Mr. Narang, the RBI dividend came in. I know it's a practice that has now been put in place, interim RBI dividend at about 26,000 crore rupees. Do you believe numbers like these point us in a direction where perhaps the entire dividend needs to come in before, perhaps there needs to be a different, a difference of in terms of getting it in tranches? Does that merit some sort of relook, review?
No, I think now see, this dividend is for the 6 month. So the RBI's accounts are up to June, July to June. They follow that calendar year. So what the RBI has done is that it has audited this account, and on the basis of that, for these 6 months, it is giving an interim dividend. So this practice is actually most of the corporates also, they have a practice of giving interim dividends. So this is in line with best practices or practices followed by other corporates as well. So I don't think so there is anything wrong with it or anything which is something needs to be changed about it. So it's pretty much okay. But what essentially I think what we should remember is that the underlying revenue growth in terms of direct and even indirect taxes is growing at close to nominal GDP or higher than nominal GDP growth. If you look at direct tax to GDP ratio in the last 5 to 6 years, it's gone up by almost 90 basis points, led by income taxes. So I think the picture is not that bad. There are certain elements which are improving. Indirect taxes have not been increasing because of the pruning of the 28% GST list, and there are other factors which are playing because of compliance. But I think in the next 12 to 18 months, you should see that improvement as well.
Maitri, I know you've had an issue with this, and I think it's only fair that I address this question with you, because one way to look at the Fisc is the borrowing number. And yes, the government has reduced the borrowing targets, but the government is excessively dipping into the National Savings Fund, and I think you raised this point while the budget was on. Do you believe, A, the government is justified in doing so, or do you believe this is the new normal given the corpus that the fund now has?
Well, the fact is that the NSSF borrowing is much more expensive, Supriya, than government market borrowing. So it will tell on us long term the fiscal health, as it is. Interest payments account for a sizable part of whatever revenue the government raises. A substantial part is preempted by interest payments. So this is again not a very good practice. The whole question, as Mr. Gopalan also mentioned, is what does the government borrow for? If it is borrowing for investment, then maybe it's a pardonable thing to do. But if it is borrowing for current consumption, as it is doing with a universal or quasi-universal basic income, then in that case, you're not going to get any return at all. So you're borrowing at a very high cost, and you're spending it on something which is not going to give you any return. Of course, social welfare is very important, but ultimately, social welfare is best paid for out of taxes. Hopefully, this is only an interim measure till such time as GST revenues increase, but I think long term, it's not a very good thing at all.
No, I have just one last question. I think we're running out of time here a little, but Mr. Gopalan, the question is that, and you've been a finance secretary, I know, it was DA, but the question is that, a lot of people fear one thing, that since the direct taxes have fallen and the government and, the tax authorities would want to meet targets, do we risk harassment? Would we risk the fact that the taxman will well be on your door? There could well be a lot of scrutiny, and many people believe, will we see that sort of harassment return? How are you going to caution against this? Should we be advised not to pay attention to this sort of a concern that's on the fore?
Okay, whenever the targets are steep and performance of the officers are dependent on how much of demand they raise or to what value of demand they raise, obviously either they are to issue untenable kind of notices or harass to get money. And in the month of March, you will see Income Tax Department goes to corporates and ask them to give the next year's money in advance, tax revenue in advance, so that they will be in a position to return it by way of refund when the new year dawns. That act will also take place at this point in time. So if you have a steep target and the economy is not good enough to provide that kind of a revenue, obviously other unsavory tendencies can take place.
Okay, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. I can't thank this wonderful panel enough, Mr. N.R. Bhanumurthy, Mr. Narang, Mr. Gopalan, and of course Maithili Busnurmal for being with us on this edition. We will take a quick breather, but there's plenty more that's coming up right here on ET Now, and it's worth staying for.